Great Wednesday. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing great, King. It's always a good Wednesday morning when I'm speaking with you, but even before speaking to you, and I hope afterwards things are good where I'm sitting, so I get to do what I love to do. And how about you?
I'm doing great. As we like to get started with our gratitude moment in that space, that's an excellent segue because I'm grateful for, again, my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, uh, breathe, have sound mind. And I'm grateful for another 24 hours to pursue my purpose in life, my home, warm bed to be in right now, and then of course a mother that's alive and sound mind. But I also want to add to my gratitude is it's a book I read a couple of months back in doing these podcasts that came up. Guy referred it because I was really advocating, as you know, conscious capitalism, and he suggested, well, you want to read another book called Spiritual Capitalism. I was like, really? I had never heard of it, and I immediately went to Amazon, to the book, read the description of the book, and brought the book, and it's changed my life. And it's called, Spiritual Capitalism. It's a book by Michael E. Hendren. And just real quick, what's really powerful about it, and I just want to make this analogy, it's like conscious capitalism is just that. It makes you aware. It gives you an idea that you should have a higher purpose for your life and be more uh, thoughtful about how you go about engaging in business, and look out for your stakeholders and create conscious culture and all those things. Whereas spiritual capitalism is more about a way of life. It's about living life according to understanding, and like business is a spiritual experience. It's the first commandment. So for me, that I'm thankful for to be in that now growth, and that it just really feels and fits in alignment with who I am and what the direction I'm going in. So I'm grateful for that. So I want to add that to my gratitude moment as well.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, thanks for that, King. Yeah, so I'm grateful for I'll give my standard comments first. Indoor plumbing, especially as it gets colder here in the Northeast, and electricity, which gives me a refrigerator with food that doesn't spoil, and for the most part is healthy food. And I have access to those things every day, and I realize that puts me ahead of 90 something percent of the people on the planet. But yeah, I'm grateful also because we're getting seasonal here. For the last 3 or 4 days, we were right in the 70s, and it's November. You and I are speaking right now in the day after Election Day, and we were in the 70s for about a week up in Connecticut. And now, this morning it was about 36 degrees. It'll get up into the 50s. So it's getting back to a more seasonable, normal kind of temperature as well. And as much as I like the warm weather, I kind of like I like when the seasons are more or less predictable. So I'm grateful for that kind of crisp autumn feel outside right now today as well.
Excellent, excellent. And
Mm-hmm.
same thing here in the Baltimore area. We are experiencing it's about a crisp 49 to 51 degrees outside. It's really a gorgeous day, really a beautiful day. And I've learned to even be grateful for days when it rains, when it's days when it's cold, because I don't know about you, but the older I get, the more I realize that I'm grateful just to be able to experience all those changes in the weather. And though, there may be some, benefits to a nice, beautiful sunny day, but it's also some benefits to a nice rainy day as well, as
Yeah.
long as it's not causing floods and things of that nature. So this being grateful is one, again, one of the 10 commandments of spiritual capitalism is count your blessings, be grateful. So it's really in line with who I am. Well, let's get started with our discussion today. This is our fourth discussion. So why don't you lead us into what we're going to talk about today? Looking forward to it.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, King. So again, we're basing these conversations on this book came out in October, Healing America's Narratives, the Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And then the tagline beneath that subtitle is Becoming More Fully Human. And what we've been speaking about the previous 3 weeks has been the 9 elements of shadow, that part of an individual or organization, or in this case, a country that we deny, that we don't know is there. And so the 9 elements, to repeat them, and I'll see if I can get all 9 of them out without having to cheat, are ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, bullying, greed, excess, and untrustworthiness. And the argument in the book is that those 9 shadow elements exist in this country and have done a lot of harm since the inception of the country, and even before the country, kind of came into existence circa 1776. And so today what we want to do is take those 9 elements, and we'll repeat them a few times as necessary throughout our conversation, and see how they really play out in the 5 kind of core chapters in the book, where we explore the shadow of this country through the histories of women, Native Americans, African Americans, the war in Vietnam, and the post 9/11 wars on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I'm just going to speak briefly to some of the consistent threads throughout all 5 of those histories. And again, we're not making an equal sign saying that the history of women is the same as history of Native Americans or of African Americans or Vietnam, etc. But there's a consistent thread throughout all of them. And we'll start with the ignorance and arrogance piece. So the United States can't take credit for the discrimination against women because it didn't begin here. But for, across cultures and for millennia, not in every culture, but in many cultures, women have been considered inferior physiologically, intellectually, etc. We know that that's not true now, or some of us know that that's not true. And if you look at the history of the United States, I mean, women have only been voting for 102 out of the 246 years of this country's existence. They were denied access to education, to the voting booth, and to most types of work other than raising kids, school teaching, and becoming nurses. So I'm painting with a broad brush here to get started. Move to Native Americans. The settlers, or explorers or colonizers, depending on your language, met with a culture that they did not know, Native peoples of the Americas. And rather than welcoming them and saying, oh, let's do a cultural exchange and learn from each other, what became the United States saw the Native American cultures as inferior. So basically took their land, killed them, entered into treaties, and then broke all the treaties. So again, painting in a broad brush to get started. So ignorance of a culture, and then arrogance in how they treated the culture, and then violence toward the culture. African American history. So take the European explorers turned settlers turned colonizers, kidnapped Africans. They met them in the African countries. And just as with the indigenous peoples in the Americas, the Europeans met them, different cultures, rather than saying, oh, let's get to know these people and do a cultural exchange, felt they were superior to them. So they kidnapped them, enslaved them, and treated them as less than human for centuries here in this country. And again, just painting the picture. Vietnam. It was much easier for the United States to carpet bomb and drop napalm on the people of Vietnam, who were primarily a Buddhist country with some, Christian elements, but who were from an Asian culture, who looked different, who spoke different, and who believed some things that were different. So again, ignorance of their culture, arrogance towards them, and violence towards them. And repeat the same thing post 9/11 in Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with the actual attacks of 9/11, other than harboring some of the Al-Qaeda folks who planned it. And that's legitimate, criticism. And then the attack on Iraq, simply because members of the Project for the New American Century had been campaigning to oust Saddam Hussein even as far back as the Clinton administration. And it was much easier to go in and just attack Iraq, effectively a Muslim country, again, different culture, different language, than it would have been had we not liked the Prime Minister of Great Britain, for example, because we were more like them. So an ignorance of a culture, arrogance towards that culture, and then in those 5 examples, violence towards each of those groups: women, Native Americans, African Americans, the Vietnamese. and then the Afghans and Iraqis. So that's a real quick overview of what we're looking at. The themes are consistent throughout, seeing someone else as other than and less than, and treating them horribly as a result of that. So I'll stop there. That's setting the tone for what we're talking about.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about this last week, but I wanted to bring this back up again just for folks who may be hearing this, seeing this podcast for the first time and then catch the previous weeks. Your title of your book, and you talk about the importance of healing America's narratives.
Yeah.
And I just kind of really wanted to piggyback on that again, because again, initially, and I've heard your definition and your perspective on why you chose healing, but I wanted you to bring that back up again, because initially when you hear the way you broken down the 9 elements and you talked about the 5 different chapters you talked about, the first thing that would come to my mind prior to hearing your description of healing would be, why not change America's narratives or improve America's narratives in that context?
Yeah. So thanks for that. And I think that's a really important point, because as you know, and you and I have discussed in the past, so in the book, I get really clear on how I use language. So I'm not saying this is the right way to use any of these words. I'm saying if you read this book, here's how I'm using it. So you can disagree with it, but I try to be as clear as possible. So healing, as it's used throughout the book, healing America's narratives, is different from, now just go back to the medical perspective, is different from curing something, or from a mechanical perspective, fixing something. Healing, as it's used in the book, refers to coming to terms with things as they are. In other words, facing reality as best one can and getting as close to the truth as one can. So if we look at the United States of America, there are many narratives within this country. And I'm not going to try to name them, but there are many. And as the history of the country continues to unfold, excuse me, it's not only that there are different narratives, but more often than not, they're seen as competing narratives. I'm right, you're wrong. Nowadays, if we disagree, the narratives say, I'm right and you're un-American. That's a fairly new iteration in the last decade or so. So what the book asks us first to do is to come to terms with things as they are. And in my listening to talking heads on television and on media, people like us now, in some ways, but I mean the ones who are, have big platforms, who have hundreds of thousands and millions of listeners,
right?
And the politicians, including many of those for whom I vote, and yesterday was election day. Very few of them talk about coming to terms with things as they are. They want us to come to terms with things as they see them. And that's both on the left and the right, the political left and right. And they both do that. And very few people, there are some, very few people are really try to get grounded in, okay, I can see your perspective too. Let's have a conversation and see if we can together come to terms with things as they are. In other words, to heal these narratives. And then once we agree on how things are at some level, we can begin to, as you like to speak about, and it's a really important piece, we begin to see the systems that control us, that we've built collectively, but that control us, and how we can then begin to replace the systems that are dysfunctional. So the healing piece is so important. Let's come to terms with things as they are. And the example, I'll just give the one again. If I fall down and I break my arm, right? My personality is I'd be really upset with myself that I was somehow clumsy or whatever, because now, let's say it's my right arm, I'm right-handed. I have to brush my teeth differently. I have to do a lot of things differently. I'm just looking forward for the next 3 months. I'm going to be in a cast, woe is me type thing. As soon as I can just accept, okay, my arm is broken, I'm going to have to shift some things in terms of how I operate day to day. I may have to ask for help for some things. As soon as I accept that, I relaxed a little bit. This is true now. My arm is broken. I rely on the orthopedic surgeon, the doctors and nurses and whomever to properly set it, put the cast on it, and give me what to do and what not to do. That's the curing part or the fixing part. But the healing takes place in my mind and my heart and my belly. Oh, this is true. My arm is broken. I have to deal with this now. And that's a simple example, but it's just so important. As the next 48 hours unfold, Americans are going to come to terms with things as they are in terms of the results of the election. Some will like what they see, some will dislike what they see, some will accept the election, the voice of the people, and some, if they don't like the results, will say, well, I don't accept the results of the election. So we have to come to terms with that kind of disparity or diversity in views, and decide if we really want to operate as a democracy or if we want to operate in a way that says, when I don't like the result of a legal election, I'm going to make believe it didn't happen. So again, coming to terms with things as they are is the first step required, in my experience and view, to really enter into a healing space. So that was probably a longer answer than you needed, but there it is.
Well, no. Well, thank you for that answer. I think it helps set the context
Yeah.
so that folks can understand what we're talking within and why we're advocating, or what you're advocating in your book that you're advocating. Now, one of the chapters we really haven't discussed much at all is the chapters about Native Americans. And what I really want to discuss now, my question would be, what's really interesting to me is how, as human beings, we normally don't really show much empathy to other human beings generally because of the tribes we grew up in, and in the way of society and our culture, as you say, our the term you use escaping me now, our cultural givens.
Cultural givens, yeah.
Because the point I'm making with that is this: is that now Native Americans, for the most part, there were many tribes in the Native Americans, obviously, that prior to colonialism and American coming over here and doing what they've done. Now, I don't know how many tribes are left, but most people, they've been destroyed so much that they're not in most people's lexicon. So they're almost like an afterthought in most people's minds. Until you begin to study the history and the culture, the Native American culture, then you begin to see the atrocities and the pain they've gone through and what they suffered. And the point I'm making is, that's what I think is the first step toward the healing process, is beginning to engage with other individuals. And I think that's pretty much consistent among your book all along. It's like, as you talk about Vietnam, and you talk about how they were able to, go into Vietnam and do what they've done there as well. And it's all because of the fact is you're not seeing people as human beings. And you say the ignorance and the bigotry, but at the same time, the greed, all those play a role. But I still also think it's coming down to the fact of the excess in the context and the fear and the violence. Because now you're saying, because I don't see you as a human, then you're an object. And the typical thought pattern of how to deal with objects is move the object out of your way by any means necessary. Yeah. And I think that that's where we got to begin to engage with other people and become fully human. As we talk about what I show, is seeing people actually as human beings and really beginning to not show sympathy, but empathy and understand their pain. And the reason I mention that, because again, I've said several times on this podcast, as well as other podcasts that I do, that I'm a new dog owner, new to the world of owning dogs. And I'm just constantly studying as much as I can on a daily basis, watching videos, reading books, to really become much more understanding of dog culture and how to raise a dog and things of that nature. And in doing so, I find myself being much more empathetic toward dogs than I ever were prior to that. Like I watch puppy videos I never watched before, never paid attention to, but now I watch those with a certain level of empathy, and I feel the pain, because now I see it, how those souls can now be, they're tortured when they're not treated well, or they've been traumatized. So as we talk about the healing portion, I just want to now set the context to ask this question. As we begin to heal, what do you see as one of the best ways? And again, that's specifically with Native American culture. What do you see as one of the best ways that individuals that are interested in healing America's narratives begin to engage with that particular population of individuals and begin to start their healing process?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Now I just want to go back to how you began as I answered that question. You said, we really, one of the chapters we really haven't paid that much attention to in our conversation so far was Native Americans, which is, a perfect comment and on how Native Americans have been treated. So, we're speaking about a broad spectrum of things in the country, and the one we've said least about is Native Americans, because if you look at the news, again, you and I are sitting in places, although, I'm going to not finish that sentence, because all of where we're across the country was Native American before it got settled. But we're not real close to any of the large reservations anymore. But it's a perfect metaphor, because it's a hard thing. If you get into a conversation and you don't acknowledge women nowadays, you can get in trouble. If you don't, when we speak about race relations, we're typically speaking about black and white, white America and black America. So, the Native American stories have been just really pushed aside in such horrible ways. So to your question, though, so again, I want to apologize to anybody who's listening, because, basically African-American guy, Italian-American guy having these conversations, we basically did the same thing, even though it's in the book, but it wasn't the first 4 or 5 things we paid attention to in terms of Native American history. So not shame on us, but let's be honest about that's what happened. Having said that, in my experience, and this isn't exclusive just to me, I've learned this from my teachers as well, the place to start with this healing, and regardless of whether we're speaking about now Native American, African American women, Vietnamese, any kind of healing is with me. And I don't mean with Reggie Mara. I mean, any one of us has to start with his or herself. Start with yourself. What is it I'm speaking for as though I'm any human being. What is it in my life, in my worldview, that I need to come to terms with? What is it that I'm denying? Because if I can't heal my own narratives, I stand virtually no chance of coming to terms with any of the larger narratives that impact me in my life. So if I understood your question properly, so the first step has to be reflection. What's my shadow? What am I denying? And whether or not it's relevant to any of the chapters in this book, what are the things that are hidden from my perspective, and how can I come to terms with them? And the way to do that is, reflection. Listen to yourself talk. Listen to, if you write, watch what you write. What do you include? What do you leave out? And get really curious, especially about one of the best questions anyone can ask him or herself is, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? What am I neglecting? But you have to want to heal. You have to want to get to the truth in order to engage in a practice like that. So I'll start with that. And if I went away from your question, bring me back in, because I think I might have.
Well, no, you answered my question. I kind of went away from where I was beginning, because that's where I wanted to stay there, and I kind of got off track from my original point I was making, because in society, we often neglect the discussion about Native Americans. We marginalize them, to your point. Like, we definitely, discuss the black and white issue. We definitely discuss the women issue. That's what our media covers constantly. The only time you hear Native Americans even come up is when it was an issue with their how their culture is being appropriated, and the insult behind the names of using their faces and images in sports. Then you hear that discussion. Rather than that, you don't hear what they're suffering as far as, even though on their tribes, they're still uh, with the pipeline still trying to expand to try to do more oil drilling. Things such as how on their plantation, young Native American women are being kidnapped at an alarming rate and just disappearing, and nothing's really been done about it. They haven't found out who the killer is. They haven't found out what's happening, but it's been over 40 or 50 different homicides within a 2-year period of time where these women are just disappearing and they're finding their bodies later on. And that's not even a discussion that gets much attention. So that's just something they have to just deal with on their own plantation. And so, again, that's to me like a metaphor for how, to you, what you were saying before, even though in our defense, we were originally going through the chapters in the book kind of chronologically in order. So we were definitely going to get to that chapter, and definitely will have a discussion where we really delve down much deeper on that specific chapter specifically. But I just started to believe that in my own personal pursuit, as you talked about in your answer, that starting with me, that's the path I'm on, because I'm really on the path of becoming more fully human and really understanding everything from all sides. And this is for someone who grew up, and again, I use this as my growth process. I'm going to explain that in its entirety. Because, when you first grew up in this, the way I was raised, the first thing you understand is your identity is you're a boy, right? And you're a boy. Boys are expected to do this and behave this way. Yeah. And then the next stage was, okay, now you're a black boy and what that entails, right? So now my identity now becomes my race. So everything for me now is black everything and that black perspective on everything. And then that led me into, I began to realize that now I'm becoming more into my own individual names. Now it's my name is my identity, putting King as my name and choosing that as what to be called now by my last name, going by my last name, not because of ego, mainly for 3 real reasons, real quick, while I make my point. It was mainly because working with the military, not for the military, I got used to hearing my last name because they use your last names in the military. And I got used to hearing it, and it became commonplace. The second reason was when I started business networking, there's also so many Chris's that I got tired of always trying to identify myself. I'm the black Chris or whatever the Chris may be, the bald-headed Chris, or, whatever, separated myself from the other Chris's in the room. And the third reason was I hate when I introduce myself as Christopher King, instantly people shorten it and just say, "Hey, Chris, how you doing?" It's like, then I got to correct them. I want to be called Christopher. So to eliminate all of that, I said King. And then the final reason was really because I look at it upon myself that I have a responsibility to build kingdoms. And I have a greater goal beyond just my own needs of concern that I have to be always considering my actions and my behaviors. So that's why I go by King. Now, that became my identity as a third step. Then the fourth step now becomes being more of a spiritual being and transitioning into that. And then that fourth step, now I'm beginning to see the empathy of how other human beings are treated, whether they're women, whether they're Asians, whether they're whatever the ethnicity may be, whether the color of their skin may be, whether their sexual orientation may be. I now see the humanity in them, and I deal with them accordingly as a person who wants to do all things with love. And of course, I don't do all things with love, but that's a journey, and that's a path, and that's a progression that I'm on. So my goal now is to study, which I do, more Native American history, so I can really understand their perspective, what's important to their cultural identity, and not just go by what the media now, because I know the media is now really all about capitalism, unconscious, unspiritual capitalism, which is about selling products and moving as much, getting more of your pocket, money out of your pocket, and more control over you as much as possible for the end result. So they're never going to give you a good perspective, but really begin to study the traditional ways. And I see a lot of similarities in how the culture of the Native Americans was aligned with the culture of the Africans, where I come from and my descendants come from. So I just want to share that you're absolutely right. I just want to agree with your answer to my question, that you're absolutely right. It starts with you. And I see that how, starting with me, my mind is becoming more conscious, more aware, more empathetic, and more emotionally intelligent as I began to grow as a human being.
Yeah, so beautiful. And I appreciate the way you unpack that. And I just want to make one comment and then go back to a couple of specific examples of the Native American history, which is there are over 500 extant tribes. In other words, tribes that are still, or nations that are still in existence. Some of them are very, very tiny, but there are over 500 still in this country, which is pretty remarkable. But to your point, the trajectory of what you did, first as a boy, then a black boy, and then as you kind of unfolded your trajectory, that's a perfect example of the language that I use in the book for a development, where first it's about me, and then it's about us, and there are various us's. I mean, you just described it. So the boy is the masculine us, the black boy is the combination of the masculine and the racial us. Then it's about all of us, right? All humans, and very, very, very few, I would say people on the planet, but more specifically Americans, live in that space. Most of us can talk about it. Yeah, we're all human beings. We're the same species. But if you look at and I'm smiling as I say this because it's ironic, but it's not funny. If you look at the violence and the divisiveness, we dehumanize each other for a variety of reasons today, November 9th, 2022, and for the last 246 years in this country, and going back, millennia in the history of humankind. And then the last step would be all that is, identifying with, call it the universe or creation, but at the very least the planet, taking care of this sphere hurtling through space that's our collective home. Like, there's not another one waiting for us. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all the other billionaires who want to travel into space aside, they're not going to save all of us with their explorations. So going back to the Native American piece, and again, I'll ask for any Native Americans who might hear this to, pick on one or two specific examples from a very broad history. And even as we talk about Native American history, the history of the Lakota Sioux is different than the history of the Iroquois, or the difference, or the history of the Paiute, or the difference, or the Apache. There are so many nations that we just lump together as Native American history, just as we speak about African American history. We don't, notice that we never speak about, I'm Italian American descendant, second generation. Very, very rarely do you hear people speaking about, a Nigerian American or an Ethiopian American. It's just kind of lumped into African American. We'll get back to that in a second. But, the whole ignorance, arrogance, greed, violence piece, virtually every time that the United States federal government entered into a treaty with a given Native American tribe, the treaty was broken because something of value was found on the land that the federal government had thought was not valuable. So every time they discovered gold somewhere, they broke the treaty. Every time, this happened in the Southeast, especially in 1830s, the Andrew Jackson administration, passed the, I forget the exact name of the law, but it was basically a law that pushed Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. And they did that because more and more Europeans were coming. And in order to open up more plantations and farms, they needed to remove, it was called the American Indian Removal Act. That's the short version of it. You needed to get them out of the way so that more and more people could, work their farms with enslaved Africans, grow their cotton and other crops to make money. So there's the greed piece. So they moved everybody across west of the Mississippi, and that was the, if I'm not mistaken, the Cherokee, the Seminoles hang out for a longer period of time. The Chickasaw, the Creek were moved, and they were told they would have the lands west of the Mississippi for as long as the grass was green and the sun was shining. until more people came from Europe and more things were discovered on those lands. So they kept on breaking the treaties. Greed kept on coming into play. And it was easy to do that because the Native Americans weren't seen by the state governments or the federal governments as fully human beings. They were seen as other than human. Their cultures were strange, their traditions were strange, their rituals were strange. So I'll give one quick example, and then I'll be quiet for a moment. So one of the places where these different beliefs really hit each other was after a lot of treaties had been broken, a Paiute wise man, shaman named Wavoka had a vision that if Native Americans would dance the ghost dance, a dance that came to him in his vision, that the Native Americans would defeat the whites, the Europeans, that it would make the Native Americans immune to the bullets of the United States federal government army, and that all of the whites would die in a great flood. Okay. And so if you dance this dance, those things would come true. Now we listen to that and say, okay, obviously, that's hokey pokey, hocus pocus rather, not the hokey pokey. But if you hold that up against, I grew up Catholic. If I said a certain number of prayers every day, especially on Fridays, and I did certain rituals, going to church every Sunday, especially on Christmas and Easter, and I confessed my sins, and I did certain things in a specific way, that all war would end. And millions of Catholics did this for lots of years. Some probably still do. And they believed that somebody named Jesus was crucified, died, and then physically rose from the dead. His body ascended into heaven, and he sits next to his Father God with the Holy Spirit, this magical dove. All right. So if you take Wavoka's vision of being immune to the bullets, and you take the Christian vision of this magical ascension into heaven, fully bodied, they're all myths. All right. Yet, the Christians felt that their myth was the absolute truth. Well, those who danced the ghost dance believed theirs was as well. And so some years after the ghost dance was first initiated, as some Native Americans were moving from where they were to a reservation, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred, where two different battalions of federal troops slaughtered, and I forget the exact numbers now, but hundreds of Native American men, women, and children. And neither Wavoka's belief that if you did the ghost dance, you would be immune to the bullets, nor the basis of the Christian belief, which is love one another, neither one held up during the slaughter. So we see again that, the difference between myths, whether they're well-intentioned or not, whether they're European Christian myths, and that's even a misnomer because Christianity didn't begin in Europe. We have to really differentiate the myths from what's true in the world. And to this day, the peoples of the indigenous tribes of the Americas, and again, there are over 500 of them, have been given the worst land in the country on reservations and given a choice of staying on those lands or assimilating, leaving the reservation and coming in and assimilating to the, basically Western European culture that became America. So it was grounded again, ignorance of a culture, arrogance about the culture, greed, it was discovering gold or uranium or whatever it happens to be. And then violence when treaty betrayal wasn't enough. So it just persists. It continues in our history. And we have to come to terms with that in order to begin to heal these narratives. So that was a bit of not a rant, but an overarching view. Yeah.
But no. I definitely want to thank you for that. That definitely wasn't a rant at all, because what you're showing is that you truly are the manifestation of what you're advocating and what you're teaching in your book. Because the fact that you did the history and you did the work to understand the distinction between the different type of the numbers of American Native American tribes. Like, I never knew there was more than 500. I knew there was more than, the most you ever heard of was 7 or 8 throughout my life. Of
Yeah.
course, Apache and so on and so forth. But I didn't know all the others, nor did I put forth any effort, nor that I know most other folks who put forth any effort unless they were a true historian. But you did it in the context of caring, and that's what I really enjoy doing the show with you, because you're a living manifestation of becoming that fully human person to point that out. And I think that's what's wrong with one of the narratives we have in America, is that we always want to make everything different, a monolith, right?
Mm.
We want to always talk in monolithic terms or generality terms when we're talking about different people other than who we are. So we say black men are this way, white men are this way, or white people are this way, black people are this way, all women are this way, etc. Right? And thinking about the fact that I was watching net funny how what comes through my feed on YouTube. I know YouTube algorithm just doesn't understand me at all, because I just go all over what I look for. So they don't know what to recommend a lot of times.
Yeah.
But it was a short clip from show by this comedian by name of Chelsea Handler, and she had on a show she had on Netflix, and the clip was her sitting down with a Native American tribe. I forgot the tribe. The tribe I had never heard of before. And what I liked about her is that she wasn't ashamed to show her ignorance. So she had made a statement that most people in normal American culture who are ignorant of Native American culture would make. And it was like a general statement about all Native Americans. And the woman quickly checked her on it and said, "No, that doesn't apply to us. We're
Mm.
totally different." And she began to break down different tribes and
Yeah.
why they were different. And so Chelsea was like, "Thank you for helping me understand that without being offended." Right. And that's one of the most important things about communication, is that you got to understand that when you're talking to someone who does not really understand your culture and your mores,
Yeah.
they're going to make ignorant statements.
Yep.
But you can't be offended first and then come with anger as an energy and think things are the healing process begins, right? And one of the things that really bothers me now, and I hear it every election cycle, is they always talk about the black vote. And
Mm.
so the black vote is just really just one block of vote, even though the majority, from a percentage standpoint, does vote Democratic. But what was interesting to me, as I was watching election returns last night, how many black Republicans were running against, white Democrats.
Yeah.
And there was never, outside of the Senate race in Georgia, you had a black Republican man and a black Democratic man. That was the only race where, that the economy was there. But typically, I had never seen so much diversity in the Republican Party where blacks are actually running. They didn't win, but I'm just saying that that's my point, that there is no one black vote, right? That blacks are monolithic in how they vote, how they act, and they're becoming even much more. That's coming much more to the surface now in all the discussions. Same
Yeah.
thing with women. Women get generalized all one way, and the same thing with men. When we date, we say, women are this way, and the women may say men are that way. And that's why I think the first steps we have to do is what you've done, is really begin to really understand the nuances and the differences among the different types of tribes. So again, I want to commend you on that. And then the last stage I want to talk about is just how horrific that not only did America as a culture come and decimate and almost completely wipe out the Native American population, but then, like I said, the culture built up so many racial terms, whether it's in sports or not. Like in Maryland, there's this uh, avenue, and it's called and it's a very main thoroughfare in this area called Fort Washington. The name of the avenue is called Indian Head Highway,
Mm.
right? And then you don't really think about it when people give you directions. It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, I go make a left on Indian Head Highway, so on and so forth. But then when you really, get it to a point where you're like, Indian Head Highway, why do they call it Indian Head Highway? And then you hear the history of it, and people will tell you who know, oh, that's because when a certain U.S. Uh, troop came and slaughtered the Native Americans that was there, to scare the other Native Americans away, they put their heads on posts all up and down this street or this area, and it became Indian Highway. And now, see, no one's advocating changing that name. That's just accepted into American culture, or well, definitely into the Maryland culture. No one is saying, or if it is, I don't hear it. Right? If there are Native Americans who are advocating change the name, maybe it's not a lot of Native Americans in the Maryland area to advocate for that change. But see, when I'm advocating, it shouldn't take Native Americans to advocate for that change. See, we're really human beings, and we really become a feel human once we understand that history. And the more I think about it now, as you're helping me discover this. This is something I never really contemplated now until our discussion. So you have bring this consciousness out of me through today's discussion. That's something I should advocate for, because we and my people, as when I say my people, I'm now specifically referring to Black people, we keep pushing back against injustice, and we're saying everything's injustice. Well, that's predominantly Black area now. So we should be getting ways of fighting injustice everywhere. And see, that's where I want to transcend. So when I say my people in a broader term, and that's what I'm really looking to identify now, it transcends race. It transcends gender. It's about people who I'm in line with. And I just want to make this quick point to something that I recently intellectually understood, but I now began to apply into my thinking in my life. And that is, I think the biggest mistake most people make is they look for commonality among individuals. You and this person have so much in common. I want to connect you to this person because you and this person have so much in common. And I think that's a biggest mistake that we make. I think it's a travesty, actually. I think what we should look for is alignment. And that's a big difference between alignment and what's in common. Like you, and I'm not saying you fit this, I'm just using this as an example. You and I both may drink. We might have that in common, that we drink. But you may drink for the reasons of the high trauma and pain. I may drink to be social. But then when we hang out, because we have it in common, that might be where we initially start to hang out. But then I realized you drink far too much. And then you need a drink. And so that becomes problematic beyond the social context. But if we're in alignment, which is deeper connection, is more intrinsic, where I believe common is more external, then that's a stronger bond. And you can build with that. And when you look for alignment, then that's going to supersede color, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I want to comment on that last piece, because I mean, that's how I vote. That's why I voted yesterday. As far back as I can remember, I'll vote for a candidate who I might disagree with on a given issue, if I feel that his or her worldview is aligned with mine. In other words, that's where I look for somebody whose worldview is in alignment with mine, even if we disagree on this issue or that. Somebody who sees the world more or less as I do. So that's really important for me. The other piece is you mentioned, just the structure of the book, and I'm very aware of, and this was not the hardest thing, but the riskiest thing for me. So my grandparents came over at the turn of the 19th into 20th century, and they were peasants from the countryside in Italy. They were, they had a grade school education, barely, didn't speak English, olive skin. They weren't treated well when they got to Ellis Island, but they came to life and they managed to do that. But I'm very aware that when I write about the history of women or Native Americans or African Americans, etc., that I'm a tourist in those histories. In other words, it's not my history. So I'm really careful about what I say and what I don't say, even when I just did the riff on Wovoka earlier in this conversation. That's my best memory of what's in the book. But I'm really clear. I'm not a women's history scholar, Native American history scholar. I'm an adult development scholar. I understand development and cultural evolution. And the book is about that in America. And I use those histories as examples. But we have to be really careful that we don't fall into stereotypes when we speak about histories other than our own. So that was a big that was a warning sign I kept on my computer screen as I was writing for 3 years. Like, make sure I don't overstep, and make sure any statements I make are historically accurate, and that any opinions I offer are identified as opinions as opposed to facts. The last thing I want to say, because I know we're coming near the top of the hour, is your point about just taking care of my particular view, as a black man, a white man, a man, a woman, a gay, a straight, or whatever. And Bell Hooks, I think I've raised this before, and I quote her in the last chapter of the book. In her book, Outlaw Culture, she addresses that very thing. And that was back in the 80s or 90s. I forget the year. And she says, I'm puzzled by, and these are the two examples she used, by the black men who are on the front lines of racial equality, but have nothing to say about gender inequality. And I'm puzzled by the white women who are on the front lines of gender equality, but have nothing to say about their black sisters. So we all need to be addressing any politic of domination, regardless of who it affects, because that's the system that we have to really address. If anybody is being dominated, we're all being dominated. And then she finished by saying, what we really need is an ethics of love. And that's it. I mean, right there. So I feel better, writing this book. I'm not going to change the world with it, but someone like Bell Hooks, who's a brilliant writer, and we just lost her in the last 12 months, I think 12 to 15 months. And there's just so many other great voices. So we just need to be having these conversations and writing these books and being really clear. It's not just this group's issue. It's all of our issues together. And that's easier to say for a guy with my skin pigmentation, for a guy, with my skin pigmentation. But I think it's true. So I'll put a period at the end of that sentence.
Well, yeah, and I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Just as Dr. King once said, that what we need in this country is a revolution of values, right? And that's based on that same token. It's like we got to really begin to not look at things from only our own self-interest. And that's why, our show, we talk about become more fully human, because when you look at us as we become more fully human, we no longer put ourselves in these tribes based on our race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, politics, whatever. We're human. And my tribe is people who I want to build alignment with. And if you're aligned with my principles and my purpose in life and my values, then that's who I want to build my alignment with. Yeah. And that's where I think it's the strength. So as we are near the top of the hour, I want to give you an opportunity to go through it and say, what are some key action steps individuals can take to begin to start becoming more fully human and start healing?
Yeah. So in addition to the self-reflection piece that I mentioned earlier in the conversation, around healing, what is it that I'm missing? What do I need to heal in my own life? I would say, pick a history with which you're not familiar and do some reading in it. So whether it's, it might be the history of Europeans coming over here. It might be the history of a certain group of African Americans. It might be the history of a certain Native American nation. It might be the history of women, depending on, again, your own cultural givens. Read about a different history and read about it. There are some good things online, but, if it's just somebody you've never heard of before talking about history, you have to be really careful what your sources are, because not everything online is true. I hate to even say that, but do some serious study in something that you don't know about. That's about folks who have a different experience or a different history than you do, and begin to learn that way, and then reflect on your own perspectives as you do that. That's a great place to start.
Excellent. And one of the things we want to do now is, why don't you start us off, Reggie, with who you would like to share today as your example of someone who exhibited those fully human characteristics?
Yeah, so somebody that I've become aware of in the last couple of years, and she's in government. She's a congresswoman from, I think it's the 47th congressional district in California. Her name is Katie Porter, and she's incredibly clear, and she's actually in a tight race. And her race hasn't been called yet as to when we got on the air today. But in her hearings, in her conversations with everybody from the leaders of the financial industry to, and she deals a lot with economics, and she's a really bright light, but she's just incredibly clear and fact-based, and she rarely gets emotional. And I think she's for me, an exemplar, and there are others, but an exemplar of leadership in the United States House of Representatives. So, I'm cheering for her to win because, again, her votes, she's in California. She doesn't affect my life day to day here. But I just find her to be really clear. So that's Representative Katie Porter. And there are others I could have picked, but she just comes to mind now because I saw this morning she was in a tight race.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like Katie Porter. She definitely has the understanding of, she's one of the few politicians I've seen who has a true understanding and competence of economics and policy, and definitely warrants her position for sure.
Yeah.
Mine would be, as we talk about Native Americans, I want to point to one who I feel has got lost in history, but showed true humanity, brilliance, bravery, as well as elegance. And that's Sacheen Littlefeather. And Sacheen Littlefeather was a woman who Marlon Brando asked to come and accept his Oscar nomination for The Godfather back in 1973. She just recently died as well at the age of 75. And what I found to really be very interesting about her story was that she was actually 27 years old when she had to walk on stage, and they gave her 60 seconds to accept his speech. And they told her that if she said anything that they didn't like, she would be immediately removed from stage. And John Wayne even tried to block her from even speaking. They had to hold him back because he didn't even want her to speak at all. So so people, I'm saying this, imagine having to go on stage where you got a room full of people who don't like you at all, who don't even know you. And then you have to sit here and say you're going to accept an award for an accomplished actor who everybody's expecting to see, and disappointed that they're not hearing him, and you're the first they have to sit and look at. And for her to show that bravery and walk out there and that courage, to me, that's someone, again, and throughout her life, she was also an advocate for Native American rights, but just a great woman that needs to be recognized. And so mine today is Sacheen Littlefeather.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, because I remember that event at the Academy Awards. I mean, not at the Academy, from television, but I didn't know the history behind that. So I remember his refusal to accept it on his own, and that a Native American woman had been asked to do that for him. So I appreciate that history. Yeah.
Yeah, just real quick, as before we wrap up, I saw him on another interview. He was on the Dick Cavett show after that had happened, maybe years later, and he was asked a question: do you regret not accepting your award for The Godfather? And would you change anything about it? And he said, the only thing I would change would be I would make sure that I would be more vocal with my non-interest in the award. I didn't want the Oscar for it. So, he still stood there. And like I said, Marlon Brando, I used him as one of my fully human connections before. I think he was someone, again, gave money to the Black Panther Party. He went out of his way to be an advocate, used his celebrity status for that. And to me, it doesn't seem like we have too many of those people who are celebrity, who are coming from that cloth, as people say, cut from that same cloth as this gentleman was. And that gets lost in history. You have to do research on Marlon Brando to realize those things, as opposed to that just really being attached to who he is.
Yeah.
So, thank you. I'm sorry.
No, I said great. No, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, Reggie, thank you again for another great show, and your investment time and energy. And again, you talked about, as one of the action steps forward was to go out and study another person's culture that's different than your own. Well, there's no better way to do it than your book. So go out, definitely people purchase the book. I think that you will find enlightening and something that will help expand your consciousness. And to me, that's the path we really want to advocate everyone becomes on. If we all focus on making that a part of our goals to become fully human and all our actions and what we do, then the world would be a better place by default in that space, and we can really begin the healing process. So thank you, Reggie, again, for your investment of time and energy and your commitment and your courage to write the book. And I want to thank our listening audience for listening in on another episode of Fully Human Connections. Until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., take those action steps, read about someone else's culture, explore ways to become fully human, and don't run from the conversations. Commit to it. We don't have the answers, but we are committed to the conversations. Thank you.